I'm going to set up record. Okay, we are now recording. Isn't that exciting? And then what I will do, it takes me a little while after class to, if they're fairly big files, to process it and then post it on YouTube. And then if you check back, certainly by tonight or tomorrow, there will be a link to YouTube that will have this class discussion. So if you missed something or something like that, you can go back and you can use them for review. You can do whatever you want. It's one of the advantages of not meeting personally, is that we can actually record these things. All right? The other thing I'll remind you of is if you're not speaking, you might want to mute your microphone so that we don't get feedback. That's, sometimes that becomes an issue. It's just enough distortion that it can distract people. I'm getting kind of used to it, but some people aren't. All right. What I wanted to do today is just talk a little bit about the purpose of this class in the context of this phrase that you hear thrown around a lot of globalization. All right. And two things really that I kind of want us to think about today. One of them is, what is globalization? When we say it, what do we mean? What's the picture in our head? And then kind of how do we feel about it? All right. What do we see as the costs and the benefits of it? What are the long-term implications of continuing to globalize and things like that? Because it's for that reason, these phenomena that we in aggregate associate with globalization is the only reason why a class like this is relevant. Because if we did not have the capacity for transportation that we have, if we did not have a globalized economy, if you really were buying things that were only produced in America, then there's a point beyond which you probably wouldn't need to care very much about the rest of the world. But that's not the world that you live in, all right? Hold on, somebody needs to get in, all right? So if I ask you, okay, what's the sound you hear or the picture in your head when someone says globalization? What would that be?
Mass exploitation.
Say that again, because you're on a delay there.
Sorry. Mass exploitation.
What do you mean by mass exploitation?
Take what happened with African countries, most of the southern part of the American continents, with eventually when countries begin to look for means to produce outside of their country, they inevitably hit a system of exploiting other countries for their natural resources.
Okay, but what I'm asking is, you haven't really explained to me what you mean by exploitation. When you say exploitation, what do you mean? What does it mean to exploit something?
I mean,
Try something, Zachary. Try this. Just hold on. Zachary, stop.
You need to
stop. Zachary.
Then you need to serve.
Can't hear me. Listen, because you're on what looks like a real slow connection, if you want to talk, sometimes this works. Try killing your video and see if that makes your audio come through better. Try again and tell me what you mean by exploitation.
Is this better? Is it coming through better?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
By exploitation, I mean taking the resources that other places or peoples need for their basic survival and to keep themselves at a proper pace of keeping their people fed and well in the name of your own self-interest.
Well, ultimately, though, that's a kind of normative or value-laden interpretation of the notion of exploitation. Ultimately, if you're exploiting something, you are making productive use of it. That's all it really means. In other words, here I have an advantage. I have a resource, or I have an access point, or I have something. I have land, labor, capital. I'm going to make productive use of those things to my advantage. Okay, that's what exploitation is. What it sounds like you're doing is taking us in a direction, theoretically, of, say, what a post-Marxist would employ by virtue of invoking this notion of exploitation, like exploiting the proletariat by alienating them from the product of their labor and things like that. Is that what you're thinking about? In addition to just raw materials. In other words, oh, you have gold, I'm going to take it. Well, if you go someplace and you find gold and no one's making use of it and you take it, as a hypothetical, how many of you would say, yeah, that's exploitation? Is that exploitation? Because what Zachary was saying earlier is really important. If by exploitation, you don't just mean, well, we found something and we're making productive use of it to our advantage. But what instead you mean is, wait a minute, you went someplace, you found something, people were making productive use of it to their advantage, and you took that away from them. Does the difference make sense? Okay, it sounds like Zachary is saying the second one. In other words, you're actually taking from people something they now have that is deeply embedded into their economy, into their society, into their culture, and you are alienating them from that. You're taking it away from them, okay? But what if you're just going someplace and you're finding something and there may be people there and they weren't using it and you take it? Is that exploitation?
It's not exploitation. Much more of it is a kind of theft.
Well, it is only if someone's already claimed it by right of property. See, the notion of theft presupposes an established and generally recognized right to private property. Otherwise, there's no theft. In other words, what I'm trying to say, and again, let me explain what I'm doing here. Zachary's not incorrect. I'm not arguing against him, but part of the method that I use to draw people out is give you something to push against. So Zachary and anyone else who might be concerned about this, I'm not going after Zachary and thinking, oh, look, man, I'm gonna set this boy straight. He doesn't know what he's talking about. That's not what I'm doing. I think it's an interesting and productive line of conversation, and I'm trying to goose it along a little bit by giving you something to push against. If I were to say, for example, if you encounter a society, right? You get in your ship, or you get on your horse or your camel or wherever you are, and whatever transportation you're using, right? And you go someplace and you find people and you say, hey, look, there's gold. There's gold there, okay? And the people there are like, yeah, there's all kinds of cool stuff around here, but we're migratory and we just sort of use these. We're nomadic and we travel across these lands, meaning they're not establishing gold mines. They're probably not making productive use of gold. And you take the gold. How is that theft?
It is still something from them that they might use for a different reason, like, say, white sage with certain Native American groups. White sage has a very important spiritual and religious connotation to it, but you have a lot of corporations that grow it outside of Native American reservations. They don't buy it from Native American producers solely in the name of profit. It was being used for a very specific reason, but a company or a corporation, what have you, decided, I'm going to take that and use it for my own means to make myself more money. That would be
hold on just a second, because you're implying theft where you could argue no theft exists. If I see that something is useful, and these people over here have a certain value for it, and these people over here may have no value for it at all, and then I find another value that the first people don't see in it, and I decide to use that, and I go and I grow it on my own land, and I grow it for myself and everything else. Explain to me, someone, how that is theft.
Because it is still part of their property. If, say, I grew up on, let's make up a
Zachary, 1 second, okay? I want to go back to this idea, and is it Eliza? I can't. Yeah, okay. We have to kind of clarify our terms. If we're going to use the normative term theft, meaning taking something of value, first, you have to establish a right of ownership. If you are dealing with people, and we see this throughout, particularly prehistory, but also history, where people don't have the same notion of property, okay, then it seems to me difficult to make an argument for theft, especially if you're not actually taking it from them. but it's like, hey, look, they're doing this thing with this plant or this substance or this precious metal or whatever. We can do that too. Okay, but we're going to do different things because our values are different from theirs, and we're going to use this resource, this substance, whatever it is, for something else. Let's use another example. Okay, petroleum. Okay, and petroleum products. If you go to some part of the world and you drill holes in the ground and you bring up oil, okay, is that exploitation? Yes. Because you are attempting at least to make productive use to your advantage of a resource that the planet provides you. Thank you, dead dinosaurs, okay? If it is on land where other people live, okay, but they're people who historically don't have the same concept of property rights and particularly private property that, say, a Westerner would have, is it theft?
It is a different kind of theft. It would be a kind of, don't know if this would be the right word, but a type of colonialism. You're using, this is my idea of property. This is my idea of what this is worth. To me, it doesn't matter what it's worth to you. I'm going to superimpose my beliefs of what ownership is and what taking is, regardless of your culture and what your personal beliefs are.
Well, why should you care? And let me just hear from someone other than Zachary, although Zachary, you're making great points. But why should I care what someone else's values and beliefs are? I've got my own. Or maybe I've got none at all. Why should I care? I mean, really, be honest about this. Why should I care? Not because it makes me a nice person. What if I don't think it makes me a nice person? I think it makes me a gullible idiot. Why should I care? Somebody believes something and I don't. Does that make me bad? Somebody believes in God and I don't. Does that make me wrong? Okay, and I act on my lack of belief. That is, I will go someplace that believers in God consider to be sacred, and I'm just like, no, it's an interesting place. I just want to walk around a little bit. And they're like, no, you can't go there because that's where our God lives. And I'm like, but I don't believe in your God. I don't mean to be disrespectful, Well, yeah, you are being disrespectful, and you should have known better, and we're going to punish you because you should have known that that's where our God lives. Have I done something wrong? I don't mean have I inconvenienced people. Have I done something bad? Is it bad for me not to share other people's beliefs, not to share them? I'm not denying them. Is it bad for me to say, those are stupid beliefs and you shouldn't have them? Yeah, it is, because it's none of my business. But is it bad for me to say, that's not the way I see the world? Am I wrong?
I feel like it's okay to have different beliefs, but I feel like it might be wrong to disrespect it.
How do you know, though? It's a great point. How do you know when you're disrespecting someone's beliefs? It assumes, first of all, at least hypothetically, that you know what their beliefs are. What if you don't know? I mean, if you've traveled at all, I'm sorry, let me finish my point, and I left you sitting for a while. If you go someplace and you kind of don't know how people live and all that, you're going to make a fool of yourself. Okay, and that's inconvenient for people. But is that you doing something wrong or something bad? Or is it just like, oh, I made a mistake. I didn't realize, I didn't understand what that was for. Now, Eliza, what were you going to say? I'm sorry. You were.
Oh, I just wanted to say. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to say, like, it might not be good or bad or right or wrong, but like, if you want to be, like, I think an important part of like globalization in a positive way would be to respect everyone, like the different cultures and the beliefs that you don't have. And like, I think for the land thing, like the exploitation, like if they don't hold your beliefs about like property, but you hold beliefs about property, you can't pick and choose which things you want to respect and don't respect. Like I don't want to respect a culture, but all of a sudden I care about their beliefs about property and I'm going to take their stuff because they don't believe in property or things like that.
In fact, let me push back a little bit. Can you not, in fact, do that? In fact, don't we do that all the time? Don't we pick and choose what we want to believe in? Isn't that what our values are?
We do. I think like going to a different country though is like a little bit different.
Okay, but let's figure out how it is, because again, this is a class that deals with the notion of the world as opposed to, you know, my living room. Okay, you understand? This is where I started. None of this would be an issue if I never had to leave my living room. But that's not the way the world works. So the points that Zachary and Nanako and Eliza are making are only relevant because we don't live in our living rooms. We live in this populated world with over 7 billion people, and they don't all share the same beliefs. And so what we find it in our own country. We also find it around the world. You know, it's like, well, wait a minute. How do I know what to respect? Is it really right that I should respect all peoples and their beliefs? Because if that's true, then I have to respect Nazis, right? I mean, I do. They're people with beliefs, right? I mean, I was just talking to a buddy of mine who was a music journalist back in the day when he and I, you know, had hair that wasn't gray. And one of the things that really appalled him was he, as a journalist, traveled to Norway, particularly Oslo and around there, and was doing some really interesting reporting. This is back in the 90s on the black metal and death metal scene in and around Norway. And what he ran into was, he was like, Bill, these guys are all Nazis. You know, people are saying they're Satanists. They're not. They're Nazis. And even though he kind of, you know, he loved the music, he was a metalhead, right? So he could share the value of, yeah, metal, you know. But when he realized what they were saying, it was like, oh my God, this is horrible. I can't respect this. Was he wrong to say, I can't respect this? Because he had a lot of trouble writing about it. But if we're respecting all peoples and their beliefs, don't we have to do that?
No.
I don't think so.
Then in other words, we shouldn't respect all peoples and their beliefs. Is that right?
Well, it's like if their beliefs consist of not believing in other people's rights, like, you know, like if their beliefs don't include respecting other people's beliefs, I don't know if we have to respect their beliefs.
But you know, understand, this stuff isn't easy. It's not supposed to be. But let's look at religion, for example. Religion is one that, even though it seems ridiculous on its face, we will fight over it. Religion does not compel us to go to war, properly understood. Other things do. But religion is a wonderful mechanism for helping to mobilize people to go to war and keep them fighting. So is nationalism. And yet people would also argue, no, religion is a good thing. I mean, religion teaches you discipline and deference to authority and faith, and it gets you through bad times and all these kinds of things, so you should respect those beliefs. But what if those beliefs are the Inquisition? Do I have to respect that?
No.
Well, how do we decide then? How do we decide which beliefs we shouldn't respect and which ones we should?
I feel like
Sorry, Kennedy, go ahead. Hold on, Zachary. Kennedy, were you talking? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, that's such like an individual kind of thing, because everybody's morals and whatnot, like, it's I don't know. It seems just like you said, it's a difficult question, but it seems just like such a individual kind of thing. But I don't know. I think like if, you know, the morals of, or what, it's like a group-minded moral of like, well, I don't want to say respect because that's been thrown around again.
No, that's okay. I'm not trying to say you can no longer use these words. They're all problematic, so don't worry about that.
Yeah.
But it's a good point, because here's the other part of that. When we're talking about globalization, is that really something about individuals? Is it really? I mean, and when we're talking about morality, is morality really individual? You weren't born with a morality, right? Where do you get your morality? Because you don't make it up yourself. You don't. None of us do. Where does your morality come from?
The culture we're raised in.
It absolutely, as Tim said, it is one of the things that defines a culture. think of morality as shared values, first of all. Culture, too, shared values. And what can distinguish peoples from other peoples is the degree to which they, within the culture or society, they share common values. They recognize things affirmatively or negatively. What do we value? Well, we value the good of everyone, as opposed to, well, what do you value? Well, we value the freedom of the individual. Those are antagonistic values. Don't make any mistake about that. And it's one of the things that the United States is struggling with right now. But we're not the only ones, and we always have. Was this republic that we're living in, was it really framed with the idea of, empowering the individual? Not if you read the notes of the framers of the Constitution, it wasn't. It was to enhance and protect rights to property more than anything else. That's why a lot of people refer to the United States as history's first commercial republic. The primary engine of inertia was the threat to commerce. When Daniel Shays and the people in Shays' rebellion and other, farmer uprisings and things like that were going and burning courthouses and destroying court records, they didn't want to kill people. They were trying to eliminate the debt of their colleagues, because that debt had been incurred in many cases because these people had gone and fought for this new republic, and then they hadn't been compensated properly. Or they had been cheated out of their compensation by land speculators and things like that, and they ended up in debt. Why? Because they'd been off fighting instead of taking care of their farms. Okay. And to them, given what they valued, which was the subsistence that could only be derived from protecting their farms, right? That was worth fighting for. But the people who framed the Constitution disproportionately, not exclusively, but disproportionately, were saying, you know what? Sorry, you can't have that stuff. You can't do that. We're going to have to find ways to take your power away so that you cannot break this commercial republic. Because if you break it, the rest of the world is going to pull us apart. And as I think it was Zachary started us with, they're going to exploit us. They're going to pull apart all the resources and all the engines of our economy, and they're going to exploit them for their good rather than ours. And we will not have an integrated national economy, and therefore we will not have a country. That was the concern. Okay. So it's, in that sense, it's not really about individuals or the empowerment of the individual. In fact, there's a thesis by some more radical American historians that the notion of individualism was a kind of an accidental artifact of some of the institutions that were created and nurtured in the United States as part of, the Scottish Enlightenment and things like that. The notion that the individual is at the center of all things. That's a modern idea. But it typically does not characterize and hold together societies. If the individual is more important than the collective, how can you have a society? And if morality is individual, and Kennedy, I know that's not exactly what you meant, that it's completely individual. So again, I'm not marginalizing you. I'm saying we often assume that, right? Well, when I ask in my introductory classes in particular, students will almost always say, well, what's good and bad? Well, it depends on the individual. What Tim is suggesting is, no, it doesn't. It really depends on the society within which and the culture within which the individual grows up. How do you become a racist? How do you become a sexist? How do you become a bigot? How do you become a Nazi? Or, how do you become, I don't know, a left-wing radical or a social justice warrior, or an anarchist or whatever? It could be, to some extent, your individual reaction to the norms and values of the culture you grow up in, right? Does that make sense? Tim, am I negating what you're saying? I'm trying to enhance it rather than negate it.
No, you're doing good.
I get paid for this, man. It's a great gig. I can recommend this to anyone who can figure out a way to get paid for it. Well, let's then think about this in terms going back to what we started with, this notion of globalization. One of the challenges of globalization is that the more contact we have with the world, one way to think about it, the more contact we have with the world, the more contact we have with people who are not the same as us. And it's hard for us as a species to reconcile ourselves with people who are different from us. Okay? And so if you think about some of the things that Zachary was talking about at the beginning of this discussion, he was making some good, solid points in terms of how we should think about history as something other than just modernization and progress. I think, Zachary, that was your point. And any time that you go anywhere and encounter people who are different from you, your first go-to is typically not going to be, oh, this is great, I feel perfectly comfortable here. It's not. And those of you who've done a lot of travel know that's true. And it doesn't make us bad, it makes us human. We are pack animals. The reason why we survived as a species is not because, God told us to, so much as it's because we did things in a coordinated way as a pack. We're not really herd animals. In fact, that's when human beings are at their most dangerous, is when they start to think like a herd. The notion of mob mentality and things like that. That's scary. If you've ever been in a riot, you've seen that. And it's like, this is not what I signed on for. I think it's time to go. But when you think about things like this class, okay, there's already a kind of group mentality forming in this class. We're beginning, however tentatively, to develop a sense of shared identity as people in this IS-250 experience, right? And it doesn't mean we all agree, because clearly we don't. That's not what's important. In fact, I would really worry if everyone in everything was on the same page. What I'm trying to suggest is, you know what? I don't agree with Hughes, but he's got one thing right. We do have to kind of think about this and walk through these terms. And we do have to be more precise about how we articulate our views so that people really understand what we're saying. Well, add to that not only the conceptual challenges, but maybe the fact that you don't speak the language in which the class is taught. Or it's in a culture with which, about which you understand nothing. Okay. Now, some of you, I don't know any of you particularly, but some of you may have done this. Have any of you ever been an exchange student where you've actually studied abroad? Okay. One of the things you'll notice is, you know what? I'm not from around here. This ain't Kansas or whatever, How do you deal with that? What were the experiences? Because two of you, Marion and Kennedy, both raised your hands, and if I missed anybody else, I apologize. Raised your hands and suggested that, yeah, I've been in that situation. What kind of experiences did you have? Where did you go, and what did you experience? Just in a capsulized form.
I was in Japan for a portion of my junior year. And at least with that country, they, there's so much culture within it. There's thousands of years worth of culture, as well as their practices and whatnot. And you see that through daily life and mannerisms and whatnot. And I don't know, I knew that I stuck out like a sore thumb, and you don't know those mannerisms. You don't know there's so many ways to say, a certain thing, but there's only one way, there's one correct way to say it in one certain situation. And if you don't use that certain phrase or whatnot, then you come off as rude or not knowing. I mean, they didn't really think, because they knew I didn't really speak the language, so they gave me some grace about it, but still yeah, that came up a lot, and it was quite challenging.
One of the things about, Mary, before we come to you, about Japan that really is challenging for not just Americans, but Westerners in general, is the complexity of the language. English is a very rich language, but in terms of the grammar and syntax of the English language, we don't have the complexity of a language like Japanese, because part of the complexity of the language of Japanese is derived from a deeply embedded sense of class stratification, of status, so that there may be 3 or 4, or however many, I'm not speaking Japanese, different ways to say the same thing, but there's one that is, as Kennedy was saying, is right given the person whose status you are addressing from your own status. And that's something that particularly Americans, who we like to think of ourselves as being a society where, status is kind of fluid, right? I mean, we're all middle class or whatever. That's not Japan. And it's something that's very deeply embedded in the language, which is the primary mechanism of transmitting culture and values. And so, yeah, language can really be a determinant because of the degree to which it is laden with the values of a culture. That's a great point. Marion, did you want to say anything about your experience? I think you said you had an exchange experience. Am I right?
Yeah, I also was in Japan, funnily enough. And I did a homestay weekend where I was with the family. And it was very interesting how you talk to the siblings and how you had to talk to the parents differently in every situation. Yeah,
or one thing that I thought one of the other of you would mention, this was when I got hit with, in a funny situation that is a long story not worth going into, was the culture of bowing, the notion of there are different ways to bow, and you can really embarrass yourself. And you know, you're trying to be polite. I mean, I thought I had a real advantage in dealing with Japan and Asian cultures in general because I'm tiny, and I thought, well, they'll never know, man. It's just another little guy, you know. And I, you know, I was a kid, I didn't know. But you can really make a fool of yourself. And there again, you remember the point I was trying to make earlier. You're trying to respect their values, but you're making an absolute, as the English say, dog's breakfast of it. You're just making a fool of yourself. And, you know, is it fair for you to be made to feel like such an idiot? I mean, does that seem fair?
I feel like it's in a way fair because you know you're trying your best to do what you can to respect them. And I have also lived in Japan for a little bit, and the Japanese actually take that into consideration when they see you trying, and they're like, they like that a lot. They appreciate it a lot.
Well, another part of that is you're going to get laughed at. You know, the only people I've found who are really obnoxious about that are the French. When you speak, it doesn't matter how good your French is. No, you do not understand. You know, I was like, no, I don't, man. I don't speak your language. You know, and yes, I know your Navy helped us become an independent republic, but that was a long time ago. Okay, give me some slack. You know, I'm a guitar player. What do you want from me? I don't speak any language well. I'm American, for God's sake. You know, there's that. I mean, Americans are losers wherever we go because, like the Brits, particularly the English, they're just absolutely appalled by us. But they want our teeth. You know, I mean, that's a thing. You know, they want, you know, they want a certain kind of dash and bravado and coarseness that Americans have that they don't have because they don't value it. You know, it's like, no, you guys are crude and you say terrible things and you use language in a way that we would never use it and you swear a lot out of context and everything else. And we're like, no, we don't. You know, we do it properly, damn it. You know, fuck you. Of course we know how to swear. You know, look at the Irish. The Irish use F-bombs as commas. You know, they do. Have you ever been to Ireland? If you haven't heard
I have a friend
that,
from Scotland and he does.
There you go. Well, in Scotland, I'm sorry, it's not F-bombs, it's C-bombs.
Yeah.
That was what I had to get used to. It's like, you know, we don't lean into that word very often unless we're really being, you don't know what you're talking about, blah, blah, blah. Dylan, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I said the C word is a term of endearment, actually.
You know, it's weird.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like generationally, okay? When I hear men and women, but especially women, drop the B word, you know, I mean, to us growing up, if you called someone a bitch, somebody was going to lose some teeth. And I still have to get used to that. I have to get used, or maybe I don't. Maybe I shouldn't respect that. What about that? I mean, now we're talking about subcultures, right? You know, I live in a different world because I'm what am I, like 40 years older than you? And you don't live in my world. Why should I respect it? What if I think you're really wrong? What if I think people shouldn't use that word? And I really believe it in my heart. It's like, you don't understand, you know, it's like you are demeaning each other without realizing it. You're normalizing something that is a derogatory term. Am I wrong? Should I not do that? Should I be shut up for doing that?
I don't think you should be shut up, but I think both sides need to have a little understanding, like where you're coming from, and then you have to understand where they're coming from and like how the word has changed its meaning, or like things like that, or maybe understand why you think it's offensive and maybe it's not a good reason or something like that.
I think that's the challenge, right? I have the advantage living in my own, well, what used to be my country, but is no more. At least we share a common language. But what if I'm trying to explain that to people in Japan? And trying to explain to them, no, you shouldn't do this because it's really wrong. Now what happens?
I guess you can't go into someone else's country and tell them what they can and can't do.
Well, again, we're not, obviously I can't go to Japan and tell people what they can and cannot do. I have no power to enforce that. But I mean, should I even really be telling them, gee, maybe you shouldn't do that? Maybe it's none of my business. Should you respect their beliefs? Sorry, Eliza, I stepped right on you. I didn't mean to.
Oh, no, it's okay. I was just thinking, like, it depends on how close you are to them. Just like you wouldn't tell someone, like, you just met on the street in America, like, what they should and shouldn't do. Like, if you're friends with someone in Japan, I feel like you can, like, talk to them about some things. And, like, but still, you both have to have open minds about it.
That might be the biggest challenge, because one of the challenges of culture when we carry it beyond our own social system, right, and we carry it with us in some way all the time, is what happens when we carry that culture. That is, when we carry those values and those concepts to a place where those values are not recognized. How can we expect that people are going to have open minds? I mean, suppose you are in a situation like that, where you're in a culture that's very different from your own. Now, what I'm kind of hearing is, yeah, well, you have to respect that. This is their home, and this is the way they do things, right? Is that fair? I mean, it's like, okay, in Japan, this is the way things are done. In Nigeria, this is the way things are done. And, if I'm going to go there, I have to respect that. Sort of when in Rome, right? What if you're going to Afghanistan under the Taliban? I mean, that is a culture that, if you're a feminist, for example, you're going to be absolutely repelled by that. Yeah, Shelby? Sorry, I didn't see you had your hand up.
I think as far as the safety of humans, if it jeopardizes something like that, then it should not be something that should be considered necessarily respected, or something that should be more thought of, and we should kind of think about our personal lenses as opposed to what other people think. And so if it's jeopardizing something that is like physically not okay.
What do you mean when you say jeopardizing safety or something that's
so like
not okay?
So if somebody else's culture involves something having to do with, I don't know, something very violent, like the killing of another person or something, you shouldn't have to respect that. So like
the Taliban.
Oh, no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying in general, like,
yeah.
Like as a whole. So like that's a defining line, I think.
But I'm not sure exactly. I'm being dense, I know, but I'm missing how that would apply specifically to the case of Afghanistan under the Taliban before we invaded them, where, clearly they had a very different culture, very different assumptions, very different values. Murder was a crime, okay, but it was clearly much more theocratic. Religion was a much more dominant force in the culture than it's ever been in the United States. Okay. And now, at what point do we say, oh, I'm sorry, I can tolerate a lot of things, but not that? When do we have the right to do that? Or when is it, or do we ever have the right to do that with another sovereign people, to tell them how they should live? Oh, yeah, Zachary, sorry. Is your hand up? Yeah, go ahead.
Perhaps in that scenario, it's best for you to, like, say, not be in that country if you're so against it. Like, for example, I am a big supporter of the Irish Republican Army. If I say that in Ireland, they'll be like, yeah, sure, cool, you're welcome here. But if I say that in, say, England, I'm going to get death threats.
Well, I don't know if you're going to get death threats. You probably get laughed at, But also, the police will start a file on you. There is that. But what I'm saying is, the problem is, this is the challenge of globalization. You can't just say, oh, I'm not going to go to that country. We're dealing with where do you think a lot of your finished goods come from? They come from places like Bangladesh. Where do things come from? Where does a lot of your stuff come from? China. And if you don't like China and you don't like, you don't like communism or whatever, they don't care. They don't care. So it's not, we can't just withdraw. We can't just tell China, if you don't liberate your middle class, we're not going to buy stuff from you anymore, because we would break the American economy. Let me just walk you through a few things to get you to think about this, okay? I was thinking about this before class, and one of the things no one has mentioned yet about globalization, I'm really surprised, because it's the dominant thing in your lives right now, notwithstanding the fires in California. And this is going to be tough. This is going to be a tough week. So, if those of you who are living in parts of Northern California and things like that, I mean, it's going to be a little emotionally racking for you. I mean, this Napa fire is really bad, okay? But even bigger than that and more global than that, okay, is the pandemic. If you have a situation where we can just say, oh, well, we're not going to those places, then you don't have a pandemic, okay? If we didn't have air travel, we wouldn't have a pandemic, okay? But our entire economy is so deeply embedded in capitalization, globalization of labor markets, all these other things that are the world right now. We can't just, we can't. It would be virtually impossible in the short term for us simply to withdraw from the rest of the world. It used to be that philosophy used to be called isolationism. That that there's this ethos of, well, let's just close ourselves off from the rest of the world because we won't be contaminated by them, or we won't be harmed by them, or we won't have to tolerate their extremist views and their absurd violent cultures and all this kind of stuff. But what I'm trying to suggest, the dilemma of globalization is we don't really have that option, partly because we're going to hear about it. Because part of globalization is the internationalization of information. That is, you can't just get online anytime you want and find out what's going on right now, at least from somebody's point of view, virtually anywhere in the world. So you can't hide from this stuff. You have to make a conscious effort to ignore it, but it's there and it's happening all the time. There is a situation that's heating up and could be absolutely brutally violent right now between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And you might think, yeah, who cares? Well, first of all, it involves human life and I care. But also, those things often yield genocides. Okay, think about the Syrian civil war. I realize that really kicked in when a lot of you were little kids, but that's been your whole life. Okay, it's not over. When you have a regime that claims sovereignty that's using chlorine weapons on its own people, and you have an American president who says, well, if you use chemical biological weapons, that's a red line that you can't cross, and then they do it, and you do nothing, then you think, well, what have we just done? By saying we would intervene, having them do the thing we said was the red line they could not cross, and then us not intervening, guess what? We are involved by omission because we are a hyperpower. We project force everywhere in the world. Well, you live inside that hyperpower. You can't hide from the world. You can't, okay? I don't mean that any of you would want to. I think your generation, if we had to generalize, I think has grown up with much more of a global understanding of things than any other American generation. I think more than any generation that came before you, you are much more international in the way that you see the world. But there still is this relentless parochialism of Americans where we really seem to believe we can just fence ourselves off from all these bad things. No, we can't. You know what you can't fence yourself off from, okay? You can't fence yourself off economically from what's called the China price. Economists talk about something called the China price. Does anybody take an econ class know what the China price is? I feel like I've been talking too much. I'm sorry. I'm monopolizing. I'm being a bad economist. It's this idea that China has achieved global dominance in manufacturing by lowering the cost of production and so the cost of consumption of particularly its durable goods. Okay, but when you look at the way they've done it, a lot of people criticize China and they say, well, how have you done that? Zachary's going to dig this. Well, artificially low wages, low regulation, low worker safety, zero or no environmental regulation. And then you think, well, that's exploitation of workers, okay? Without which America would have very little middle class. But then think about this. How do you think America built capitalism? With artificially low wages, little or no regulation, a Supreme Court that reflexively found overwhelmingly in favor of corporations, irrespective of what they were doing, okay, that recognizes corporations as legal persons protected under the 14th Amendment, okay? In other words, we did the same things. Oh, wait a minute. They say, well, but China used piracy and counterfeiting. Oh, you mean like America? How do you think we developed our industrial capacity? We stole it from the Germans, we stole it from the Brits, we even stole it from the French. Now, you can say, then we improved upon it, and we did what? We found ways to produce it less expensively by improving the industrial infrastructure. That is, one way to look at this, it's only one. We did 50 to 100 years ago, depending on what you're talking about, exactly what China's doing today with the same kinds of impacts and the same kinds of costs. Or go back and read about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and find out what happened to those women working in those factories when you think that American capitalism wasn't built on sweatshops. Of course it was. Of course it was. Now, does that make us evil? No, it makes us powerful. Sorry, Zachary, you had your hand up and I missed it. I think you did. You've frozen. Where did he go? Are you there? Now, you know what? We can't hear you.
Yeah, it kind of sets a bad. Is that better? Is that coming through better?
I think so.
Yeah, is that coming through better?
No, now you're dragging.
Is that
there you go.
Working?
Now it sounds like you're from another planet.
Uh-oh.
Meaning you're challenging our values, man. We have to deal with it.
That technically does send a bad precedent because it's.
Yeah,
you know,
hey, I have a suggestion. Is it something you can write out in the chat that we can look at and discuss? Try that. Okay, but do you see where I'm going with this? In other words, we can sit there and we can say, oh, well, China, you know, they're cheating and they're doing evil things and I hate communism and all this kind of stuff. Well, you know, I would remind you that in addition to China, another reliable factory for the United States is Vietnam. We lost 58,000 people from my generation in that country. And we killed, you know, between 1 and 3 million of theirs. And that's within my lifetime. Why should I want to buy stuff from them? You see, I'm not saying that's true, but you see how people from my generation will think that way. I'm not buying anything from Vietnam. You know, those guys, you know, they're communists. Ho Chi Minh was a butcher. First of all, no, he wasn't. But why? Because of the collision of cultures and values. They don't value, we were heard all during my childhood and adolescence. They don't value human life the same way we do. This is to Tim's point. That's the culture I grew up in. Okay, everybody in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union was a robot in cardboard clothing. Everything was gray and black and white. They didn't have anything in color, and they made 300-pound vacuum cleaners that no one wanted. All right, and they were just evil, and they were godless. You know, I mean, this is the stuff we heard. Our school teachers were telling us this stuff, and meanwhile, of course, we had to practice duck and cover drills because that was going to protect us. I mean, it was nonsense, okay? It was domestic propaganda. It happens in every country that is aggressively, outwardly projecting itself economically, socially, culturally, and politically to the rest of the world. You're encountering resistance. China's encountering the same thing. You know, for so long, China was relatively inward looking. You know, you build the wall and you say, we're going to protect ourselves from the barbarians. Why? Because we've already achieved our empire. It's just a land empire. But China was a colonizer in its day. I mean, they had a fantastic navy. They were a colonizer. Portugal used to be a major imperial power. Where do you think Brazil, why do you think people in Brazil speak Portuguese? It was part of a Brazil, you know, a Portuguese empire. The last colonies in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, were decolonized in 1975. That's the year I graduated from high school. Those were Portuguese colonies, and they were decolonized because of the fall of a fascist dictatorship. That's in 1975. That's not 1935 or 1945 or 1915. Okay, this is stuff that's just prior to your own lives. Let me go back into chat here. Okay, nothing yet. All right, so now all those things we're talking about, you know, the piracy and counterfeiting, you know, the notion of the internationalization of labor, all those things are reasons why we cannot easily or simply isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. And that's the main point I wanted you to think about. Okay. But it seems like most of what we've been saying here has been kind of negative. Can this village be saved? I mean, you know, are there positive things about globalization that you don't hate, you know, that aren't scary?
Yes.
What would those be?
I think that like a sharing of pop culture is a good thing.
I'm sorry, the sharing of what?
Like pop culture or just culture in general.
When you say pop culture, what are you thinking of?
Oh no. Sorry, I'm just thinking of like...
No, we're gonna get you on this one now, because this pop culture thing, you know, as a guy who grew up playing avant-garde jazz, you know, to audiences of 50, you know, this notion of pop culture is the devil's work. Okay, and I'm teasing, but I'm not. I mean, you know, remember, pop culture is taking culture and monetizing it for profit.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking of like anything that's fun and trendy in other cultures, and like people within the same age group can spread to other people within the same age group, and like they can connect around the world through like something that they both enjoy, I guess.
Well, look at the power of hip hop, you know, and rock before that. But especially, I would maybe the throw weight of hip hop is even greater around the world. I mean, you can hardly go anywhere where there's an urban environment and not hear hip hop. Okay. Now, of course, Americans think we created it, but we didn't. We did what? We stole it and we refined it. You know, we took rap and hip hop largely from the Caribbean. Okay. It was dub. It was, you know, parts of ska, but especially dub. And we did have something in the United States that probably none of you have ever heard of. And it was called The Last Poets. There was a thing in the 50s that was kind of cool that a lot of us were trying to revive in the 70s and early 80s, where you get these poets who were doing like long form poetry, like free verse poetry, and you'd play music behind them. That was kind of what The Last Poets did. That spoken word notion of music and spoken word, that's part of the origin of that. Part of that is indigenous to America, okay? But a lot of people have forgotten that, okay? But this, I think what Eliza's saying is, you know, there can be a real positive value in having a generation of people kind of sharing horizontally the same pop culture, the same reference points for what's fun or what's cool or how you're going to dress or things like that. That can, I think you're implying, Eliza, that can break down barriers that might otherwise exist, because pop culture can kind of unlock doors. Is that what you're saying? I think that's an interesting point. And as I say, I think one thing that's really done that just in terms of the soundtrack of the world is hip hop. I mean, it's just phenomenal, you know. Okay, what about anything else? I mean, there got to be something other than hip hop that's good about this.
Fast food.
But fast food's terrible. No, it's a
everywhere.
scourge on the planet, man. I mean, really, it's obesity and sodium, diabetes, and all these things. I mean, that I can't think of anything good about fast food except that French fries are the devil, and because they're really good. You know.
One good thing is that it does allow for some cultures that might not have ever had the chance to commingle to create new things. There was a news article about a woman who, I believe her mother was from Japan, her father was from Ireland, and she spent about 2 years making a personal kimono that incorporated plaid from her Irish side of the family to make truly unique piece.
Well, you can get this notion of what some people refer to as cultural hybridization, that is the fusion of cultures. Or there is even a concept of what's called fusion culture. There's fusion food, and there was fusion music. It got dominated by record studios and stuff like that and turned into shit. But the idea of world music is a kind of fusion of a lot of different kinds of music. And what it's done is a lot of what Zachary was suggesting, where musicians who might not otherwise have had common ground. It's kind of like the pop culture argument at a maybe different level, where, when I was just starting to play guitar, one of the biggest influences on me was not American at all. It was Indian classical music, because of the way they phrased things. And it wasn't just that it was exotic, it was compelling and powerful. And I wouldn't have had access to that if I hadn't heard other musicians who were either, Brits or Americans who'd been influenced by that and were kind of saying, hey, this too can be yours. George Harrison playing sitar, or, whatever, seeing Ravi Shankar at Woodstock and stuff like that, and thinking, oh, wow, that's a whole way of articulating emotion that I've never thought of. Okay. And I think that's what Zachary's talking about, is that not even just at the individual level, but it's in terms of generating entirely innovative sounds and things. Another one is filmmaking. There is a fascinating genre of, getting back to Japan, of post-World War II Japanese filmmaking, where it had been deeply influenced by American film noir. Now, what's film noir? When I say that, what is that? What are we talking about? That's way before your time, but some of you may, if you're an EMDA major or something like that, you might be familiar with that. What is film noir? What does noir mean in French? Black or dark. Okay. And the idea with film noir is the themes are dark, the characters are dark, everything is kind of brooding and muted, and you almost always black and white. You can't really do film noir in color. Okay. Well, in Japan, these brilliant directors, and the most influential for me was Kurosawa, were making these noir films where they had their version of what a gangster was, or their version of what a cop was, or whatever. Okay. And in other words, it was saying, yeah, there's this theme that was presented to us by, say, American servicemen under an occupation government or something like that, or during the wars, or maybe just before the war, right? But usually during and after the war. But we're going to do it our way. And you can see the code of Bushido is in there, and the notion of the sort of the gangster as Ronin. All of that is in there. It is not an American gangster movie. It is fundamentally Japanese, and yet you look at it and think, wow, Humphrey Bogart could be in that movie. I want to be in that movie. So that's another example of fusion culture, and it's powerful stuff. And it continues to this day. And so it's not all bad. Now, then you think about more recently, and this is where we'll sort of finish up, because we've been going an hour. That's about enough. More recently, one of the things we've seen is international migrations that are not voluntary, that are sort of forced or involuntary migrations. And this typically happens as a consequence of two kinds of things. One is natural disaster, and the other one is a disaster made by human beings. Increasingly, what we're starting to see is what we once thought was a very solid line that was a demarcation between natural and human-made disasters is starting to kind of fade away. The concept of climate change, for example, has us thinking a lot about, now I'm a lifetime West Coaster, and what's left of my family is in California, and I'm in Oregon on sufferance. I feel like I need a passport to be here. But this idea that the new normal is going to be violent, destructive fire every summer is something that was never there when my generation was growing up, and now it's starting to look normal. And you think, well, why would that be? Well, part of it is what's happening all over the world. And I'm not really interested in getting into arguments about whether or not, or the extent to which it's a consequence of human activity. That's a different day, okay? But the fact is, it's happening. It's absolutely happening. And it's happening all over the world. And, we have to make adjustments. What it's going to require is, as a species, we're going to have to make adjustments. One attempt to do that was the Kyoto Protocol that I mentioned in that little quiz that we had in class last week, where the only way to deal with this is to globalize it. to globalize the response to it. We can't do it nation by nation, or even as in the United States, many governors are trying to do it state by state. Okay, you can have some impact on that, but ultimately it has to be a global effort or it will fail. Okay, and so the notion of globalization might be finally compelling us. We have to see ourselves as kind of, you know, at the macro level, we're just a species trying to survive on this planet. You know, we got to stop doing some of the things we're doing that are reckless. The notion of what Zachary was talking about earlier with exploitation, maybe we've tried that we've gone too far too fast. And maybe we value convenience over survival. Maybe that's not such a great thing, okay? But the only response to that, it's going to require some sort of coordinated global response. I mentioned the Syrian civil war, but you can also look at the United States invasion of Iraq. Both of those things created global crises, okay? Because there was no Islamic State prior to that. And Al-Qaeda was actually, by most accounts, weakening prior to that, okay? But when we invaded Iraq and we destabilized their regime, and we did what they call de-Baathification, that is, all the members of the Ba'ath Party were eliminated from government, as we purported to do in Germany after the Second World War, there was chaos. Every institution was destroyed. And we occupied a country for the first time since Japan after the war, okay? Well, quite naturally, there was an indigenous response to that by Iraqis who thought, wait a minute, this isn't occupying government, this is my country, you know? Now, that's not the version of what we were getting in, you know, network news and cable news. It was like, oh, these terrorists, these evil terrorists who cut people's heads off. Well, yeah, because you're in their country and you're not respecting their values, and you are trying to exploit the weakness of their institutions in order to drive down oil prices and exert more control over the price of oil and do all these things in terms of projecting force into the Middle East. What a shock that people would respond violently. Again, it's not to justify it, but we're fools not to try to understand it. That is part of globalization. That's the leading edge of it. But so is the response to that. And we saw that with the unification of Europe under the European Union. It has been problematic, okay? But there was at least an attempt, led by Germany, to try and say to people who were fleeing that, you know what, come here and stay. We'll protect you until it's safe for you to go home. But in turn, the response to that was things like Brexit. It's not a coincidence that the refugee crisis throughout Europe, including the UK, was quickly followed by this demand for Britain to leave the European Union. Okay, it wasn't only because of that, but that might have been the last wedge put between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Was, you know what, let's get out of here. Let's cut and run. Let's go on our own. We shall see, you know, because, you know, my youngest boy is in London right now, you know, being a bohemian adolescent. He's there on sufferance and he's going to have to leave. And I kept trying to explain to him, I can't fly over there and get you. They're not letting Americans in right now, you know. But we're looking at, theoretically, October 31st as being a cutoff for that, okay? The other thing we're seeing is part of this notion of what some people are calling Trumpism, is the idea of Americans reacting to immigration. In this case, not from refugees of the Syrian civil war, but refugees flying the destabilization and violence of the Northern Triangle, of the countries of Central America that are most violent and unstable. And there are these massive, you know, sort of challenges of people who feel themselves to be dispossessed from their own countries simply because of violence and instability. And they need some place to go. Well, historically, the United States was the place to go. You know, yeah, you can be safe here. Now people are saying, I mean, when you hear the President of the United States say, this country is full up, I can tell you that publicly, having been someone who spent a lot of time with the published papers of the President, no president in history has ever gone on record as saying that. See, that now you have to ask us, why would that be? It's not just Donald Trump. There are a lot of Americans who believe that. We don't want you. Or maybe even more pernicious, if you're not white, we don't want you. The idea being, well, we may have different language than, say, people from Sweden or Norway or even Russia, but we can work it out. But if you're not white, we don't want you. Okay? Because you don't see people getting really mobilized and aggressive about, the Canadian border, where, by the way, you're more likely to bring in a terrorist from the Canadian border. Much more likely, statistically. Okay, so you see what I'm saying? Well, I want you to think about this notion of globalization, and kind of, I'm reluctant to just dismiss it as a negative thing, because it's not uniformly negative. It's not, but it's problematic. It is your generation's fundamental challenge. How are we going to deal with the rest of the world and not die? How are we going to deal with the rest of the world and stay out of war? How are we going to deal with the rest of the world and figure out the proper way to align our borders and our sovereignty, and yet maintain this notion that the United States is a sanctuary for people fleeing, intolerance and violence and instability? We have to decide that, and we have to decide it as a people. First check on that, arguably, is going to be November 3rd, that election. That's important. Okay, does this make sense? Again, I'm not taking sides or anything else. Several of you made really great points. I don't agree or disagree with any of them so much as I find them interesting, and I'm trying to push back on them to draw you out a little bit to think through, what you want to say, so that we have some sense of, oh, okay, I see where we're going. All right. Any questions before? There's one more thing I want to have you do before Wednesday, but are there any other questions or final comments or follow-up or anything like that? All right. If you look at the Moodle page, you'll see that one of the things we're going to do is use the CIA fact book. We're going to do a little of what I call orienteering. And you're going to have an assignment after we've looked at the CIA fact book on Wednesday. And that might be a fairly brief class. I just want to give you a brief orientation to that. And then I'm going to give you an assignment, okay? You'll have, I think I will give you, I don't want you to have to work over the weekend. Maybe I'll give you till Monday to finish that. Because Wednesday to Monday is a lot of time, and I don't want to tie up your weekends, but you'll see what it is. Anyway, the link to the World Fact Book is there. I would like you to just very briefly take a look at it and see what it looks like. Make sure you can get there and see if you can navigate it. And then we're going to talk about how people use these kinds of data to make comparisons or to find things out that you didn't know. Does that make sense, what I'm asking you to do? Just take a look at the link and be prepared to discuss that on Wednesday. All right? Anything else? All right, then I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.